the philosophy should be, which is my philosophy, is that I'm going to be a student till the day I die. All right, I like this quote. Through wisdom is a house builded, and by understanding it is established, and by knowledge shall the chambers be filled with all precious and pleasant riches. Also from Proverbs, remove not the ancient landmark which thy fathers have set. Why? Because it should be apparent at this point is that the ancient landmarks are the repositories of knowledge and wisdom. Victor Hugo in Notre Dame de Paris, he said, from the most immemorial temple of Hindustan to the Cathedral of Cologne, architecture has been the great manuscript of the human race. This is true to such a degree that not only every religious symbol, but every human thought has its page and memorial in that vast book. Now, my immersion into the study of architecture was a big part of what led me into this originally, because I was very much interested in building and architecture and so on. Trips to Europe and Central America and Egypt and stuff helped to fuel that interest. But, it quickly expanded to other areas as well. Once I began to realize that there was this kind of unanimity of underlying meaning to all of these different domains of human endeavor. So we're going to talk for a minute about the ancient guilds of initiated master builders and craftsmen. John Michel, one of my favorite authors, the late John Michel. So a tradition which has been credited by many learned men over the centuries is that the ancients encoded their knowledge of the world in the dimensions of their sacred monuments. And I think that bears out once we begin the study of it. So here are the parameters of sacred architecture as I have defined them. First of all, the symbol. And this is the encoding of the mythical and archetypal meaning, which is sort of at the beginning of thinking, the beginning of the conceptualization stage. You begin with that fundamental meaning represented by a symbol or a series of symbols. That's followed by number and measure, which is the modulus of the plan. And every ancient building had a modulus, some standard of measure that governed the layout and dimensions of the building. Then, of course, there was orientation, which means orienting to the cosmos. So it usually began with the sun and the motions of the sun, which will vary by latitude. You know that, and I'm going to speak from our perspective in the Northern Hemisphere, during winter solstice, the sun, if you look at its rising and setting points against the horizon, it's going to be as far south as it's going to get through the course of the year. And then 6 months later, it'll be far to the north. Depending on the latitude, there can be almost up to 90 degrees from a point of observation to those 2 points on the horizon, both the rising, which actually would be this way, and the setting, which would be this way, right? So the secondary phenomena would be the lunar motion. Now, you know the lunar motion is a bit more complicated. The lunar motion, the lunar orbit's tilted a little more than 5 degrees to the plane of the ecliptic. And so that's why, because of that tilt, the moon has to be on the plane of the ecliptic in order to have a solar eclipse, right? Notice the eclipse, ecliptic, right? So there's only certain times when the moon is crossing the ecliptic at the exact same time that the sun is there. And that, of course, is when we experience a solar eclipse or a lunar eclipse, which is the opposite of that. But within that motion, there is an 18.6-year cycle where the moon will have a minimum rising position and a minimum setting position, a maximum rising and a maximum setting position. And it goes through a full cycle, kind of like this. And it does that every 18.6 years. So how remarkable is it that people all over the ancient world enshrined that 18.6 year cycle of the moon in their architecture? Now, obviously, an agricultural society isn't going to need that kind of degree of accuracy of lunar observations. In fact, you're not going to have to build huge henges with 20-ton stones to track the solstitial and equinoctial movement of the sun. All you need is a stick in the ground, some backside on the horizon, and a circle around the stick. I take students out and show them how that's done. It's quite simple, actually. So why would they erect these giant monuments of stone? Like when we look at Stonehenge, we see that you have two very distinct types of stone. You have the blue stones are a rhyolite, which is an igneous rock. The sarsen stones are a sandstone, which is a sedimentary rock with lots of quartz. And I think that composition of those stones was very carefully determined, and it wasn't just random. Okay, so we have cosmic orientation, the astronomical alignments. Then we have the sighting, which I call sacred geography. And this is the association with geological and geomantic structures and patterns. So not only were these complexes of sacred buildings and temples and outliers and roadways and causeways and all of the things that created these intricate patterns in the landscape, they were doing two things. They were reflecting the heavens, like Ed was saying, you know, some of the motion of certain key objects in the heavens, such as Sirius, was very important. The Pleiades was very important. Arcturus was also important. A number of stars that were, whose motions were actually worked in, almost as if you imagine the motion of the heavens, and by projecting those motions onto the surface of the earth, creating patterns. And those patterns then are not arbitrary, so you lay out your complexes according to those patterns. And this is what I'm calling sacred geography. And also, I say with geological and geomantic structures, the work of Paul Devereaux, who I interviewed with years ago, has done a lot of work on that, but others have followed up on it, which is that many of the ancient structures are associated with the ancient sacred sites and temples are associated with the underlying patterns within the lithosphere, including fault lines, the movement of underground water, crystal deposits, and so on. And it strikes me that not only were the ancient builders astronomers, they were also geologists. And they, interestingly, like the 7 or 8 cathedrals that are dedicated to the Notre Dame in France, recreate a very, very close approximation of the constellation of Virgo in the sky. Now, that's interesting because, of course, they're all dedicated to Mary, the Virgin, the Notre Dame, right? But the other thing that struck me as interesting is, to my knowledge that I've been able to research, they are all centered over the confluence of underground streams of water. There is several streams of underground water converging under the high altar in Chartres Cathedral. I don't think I have it to show you here, but I might. You go down in the crypt below, and there's a well, and you can actually see the water table down there in the well as the water flows under. Now, there is some very interesting research suggesting that the motion of water, particularly through under pressure, under the ground, can actually affect the geomagnetic field in certain ways. Now, this can actually be amplified because, you know, the moon creates tides in the ocean, right? And they're visible. But it also creates tides throughout the entire hydrosphere. So the subterranean waters are also subjected to those tidal forces, which means at certain times of the month, you might have water moving under greater pressure than at other times. I think all that was taken into account. And then we have sacred geometry, which is the harmonic design, form, pattern, dynamic symmetry. So in other words, you've got the symbol, then you've got to come up with the modulus of the plan, which gives you your core numbers. You've got to orient it to the cosmos. It has to be sited with respect, as I say here, geological, geomantic structures and patterns. Geomancy is the study of the patterns of energy as it's related to the Earth. How many of you ever seen or tried dowsing? Quite a few of you, I think. Dowsing, I've seen it and I've tried it. I believe it's real. I've known people that work for mining companies. I've known Marines that were in Vietnam. I've known people that work for excavating companies whose services as dowsers are actually being utilized on a professional level by companies that obviously had a pretty vested interest in the results of those dowsing surveys being accurate, right? And then the final thing, alchemy, which is the preparing of the raw materials. And there were certain procedures, certain methodologies by which the raw materials were prepared. We find that really reflected in the building of the Gothic cathedrals. And I just mentioned the utilization of different types of stone in Stonehenge. We find what appears to be a very intentional effort to use contrasting types of stone and material in a lot of the North American monumental earthworks. There are, you think of an earth mound as being pretty much just a heap of earth, a random heap of earth, but that's not what it is. It's a very carefully layered and vetted multiple layers structure, and oftentimes, or in fact, probably most of the time that I've been able to see, those layers are not of the same material. They're contrasting material. In some cases, it might be heavier on the mineralogical side. On others, the layer may have more organic material in it. And that kind of brings us back to some of the work of, some of the suppressed scientific work of a number of individuals. I'll say Wilhelm Reich is one who comes to mind, who discovered in his control and utilization of what he called the life energy or orgone, depended upon creating like instruments or boxes, whatever, using alternate types of layered material that look very close to mimicking what the ancient builders of the mounds in North America. And very interesting things. And there have been a lot of studies that are kind of out there, more or less consigned to the fringe, but showing that there are unusual energies and things associated with a lot of the ancient structures. Personally, I think that those energies are just residual energies and probably only a fraction of what was actually there when these structures were operational. So in our history, we've seen that there have been a number of episodes, like I call this the Great Work, the 3rd millennium BC. Within a couple of centuries, you had all of this stuff going on. The construction of the massive megalithic structures and earthworks in the British Isles in Northwest Europe, the building of pyramids at Giza and other large-scale Egyptian works, the construction of the great urban complexes of the Indus Valley, the building of the ziggurats and other great temple complexes of the Mesopotamian Valley, and the first wave of monumental earthworks in North America. All of this stuff was going on within a period of a couple of centuries. And it all began almost as if somebody blew a whistle, and at these multiple places around the planet, somebody picked up their trowels and went to work. If we come forward in time to 1200 AD, we have the flowering of the great Gothic building enterprise in Europe. We've got the construction of pyramids and vast temple complexes in Central and South America, the building of vast temple complexes in Southeast Asia, in Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and so on, and the final construction phase of massive stone and earthwork complexes in North America, such as the Hopewell and the Anasazi. Again, within a very short period of time historically, it's like after a period of inactivity, all of a sudden something galvanized these people in these, far distant locations around the planet to suddenly decide that they're going to build these enormous structures and these complexes and so on. The interesting thing about this is, as I said, when you begin to look at all of these structures, every one of them conforms to this list right here. Now, here's the question. Were these people independently coming up with this system, independently, in Southeast Asia and in North America, were they independently going, okay, we're going to lay out these structures to show the motions of the moon? Or to embody this certain very specific sacred geometry? Or, are we going to try to orient these structures to whatever is happening geologically in the site? Is there some inspirational force that sees these people all at the same time? Or was there a tradition, a legacy of this, let's use the word technology, this technology here, and at some point, someone organized, because look, when we look at any of these things, it would require a massive amount of organization. If you think about the Gothic cathedral era in Europe, which only lasted between, really at its peak, 120 to 150 years, right? It began, construction on the first Notre Dame Cathedral began in 1130. By the end of the 1200s, the effort had almost expended itself, which is interesting because it coincides pretty much precisely with the major deterioration of climate. When we went from the medieval warm period, which was warmer than now, by the way, into the Little Ice Age, there was a series of crop failures, which led to famine, which led to pestilence, and then you had I think in about the 1340s, you had the bubonic plague, and that pretty much spelled the death knell for this tremendous enterprise. But if you look at what was built in that little period, you had over 80 of these great monuments on the scale of Notre Dame, Reims, Amiens, Chartres, Léon, these amazing buildings, these amazing structures. And then you had about 500 lesser abbeys that were being built at the same time. And then they all kind of started within a decade or two of each other and all seemed to taper off and end within a decade or two of each other. Now, at the same time, this is happening in Europe. We have the final wave of great building in the southwestern deserts of the US, out there in the Chacoan culture. We have the final wave of the great monumental earthwork structure in the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, right? Is this a coincidence that, for whatever reason, people in North America, Central America, Europe, Indonesia were suddenly seized with this inspiration to go to work and build these incredible structures, all using a very similar system? And now, even though if you look at, a monumental earthwork of North America, it's very obviously distinct from a Gothic cathedral. Nobody's going to mistake one for the other. Yet, the geometry and the proportions and the numbers that show up over and over again, they're the same. They're the same. For example, I can show you numerous great truncated earthwork pyramids that are 1,056 feet on a side. I don't know if you remember that number, but that came right directly from our dimensions of Stonehenge. Here's one of the great scholars of architecture. We find ourselves in the midst of technical advances without parallel in Egyptian history. Now, this is going back to this wave right here, 3rd millennium BC. The new problems of using stone as a building material were solved with astonishing quickness within a single century. So this is in a place now where you've basically for many centuries, if not millennium, the assumptions are that it was subsistence farmers. And then all of a sudden, they've got this tremendous engineering skill, astronomical knowledge, geological knowledge. Where did it come from? What's the source and origin of this? Dimensions of the stone blocks grew ever larger, from the small 25 centimeter ashlars of Zoser's complex to the large limestone blocks of the Giza pyramids, and up to the megalithic boulders of 18 to 30 tons that compose the so-called Temple of the Sphinx near Kefren's Valley Temple. And André Perrot, in his Sumer, The Dawn of Art, says this: now that we can view the Mesopotamian basin in all its splendor, it is becoming clear that this flame, which blazed up so suddenly in the Middle East and shed so wide a light, was kindled at several points, each with its own nuance and distinctive luster. Susa, Lagash, Ur, Uruk, Ashnunak, Assur, Nineveh, Mari, all alike were centers whose civilization advanced from strength to strength until at last, thanks to the genius of the few and the boldness of many, there was wrought forth, as in an alchemist's crucible, a prodigious many-sided art. I find that the thing I've underlined, the genius of the few. Well, then, see, that raises the question in my mind of, well, who were the few? What was the source of their knowledge, if they were real? How were they able to inspire a whole society of people. Like if you think about the Gothic, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people that ultimately had to be organized. They have to be fed, clothed, housed. For every person working, you had to have at least a half a dozen people supporting that. You had stone quarries, amazing thousands upon thousands upon thousands of stones being quarried, right? They had to be transported. They were then shaped and carved to be into the cathedral. Then you had the sculptural programs, these amazing sculptures. You had the glazing programs, the stained glass windows that still have properties that no one has been able to quite figure out, how they're refracting light so that it almost appears as if the light is emanating not through the glass, but from within the glass. The carpenters that could build the scaffolding and the formwork had to be extremely knowledgeable. And then it's laid out according to astronomical considerations. So the scientific expertise, the engineering expertise, the skill and the craftsmanship is mind-boggling. And if you haven't been to Europe and toured cathedrals, highly, highly recommend it. So I'm going to skip a few things here because I want to get, we don't have a lot of time. This is a wonderful book by Louis Charpentier, The Mysteries of Chartres Cathedral. If we confine ourselves to Gothic art, this alone puts a question to which no answer has ever been given. We know all about Romanesque origins. We follow the path from monument to monument, period to period, but the Gothic has always eluded attempts to fix its origin. The historic question remains posed. It appears suddenly, without preamble, towards 1130. In a few years, it reaches its apogee, born whole and entire without experiment or miscarriage. And the extraordinary thing is that all at once, it has at its disposal master craftsmen, artisans, builders, enough of them to undertake the construction of 80 huge monuments in less than 100 years. But how do we explain that the labor force was so easily found and so soon put to work? One does not have to be a member of the craft to realize that the building of the cathedral at Chartres was not the work of apprentices, and that all concerned, carpenters, stonecutters, and masons, were masters in their art. However, between 1194 and 1220, churches and cathedrals were being built throughout France, churches and cathedrals that were not the work of apprentices. In Normandy alone, not far away, they were built in the 12th century, 15 great churches, of which 8 were abbeys. In the 13th, 13, of which 5 were abbeys. For the whole of France, we must reckon that between 1150 and 1250, 150 monuments were put in hand, among them churches of the dimensions of those in Paris, Reims, Amiens, Sens, and Rouen. How was it possible to assemble qualified labor so quickly? And that's a question that remains unanswered. Something had to motivate and inspire these people. They weren't slaves, obviously, we know that. I mean, the scholars, oh, well, it was Egyptian slaves built the pyramids. I have serious reservations about that conclusion. We certainly know that in France, it wasn't slaves, it was people. Something motivated these people. Something inspired them. But what could it have been? And again, the question, how was it all organized so quickly and by whom? Something was going on off the stage of history that has been lost and forgotten. And I think it's up to us to try to understand what it was. And see, it's like the cycle comes around periodically, that the need goes out for some great undertaking, some great work to commence. I mean, that's kind of what the great work is. And I have felt, since I was a young man, that we are living in such a time now. So what I'm interested in is the trigger. What is it that's going to motivate us to unify as a society and undertake a great work? Because when we look at France during the High Middle Ages, we are seeing a phenomenon that required the entire society to be oriented around this work. I mean, if I think of modern examples, maybe the closest I can come to is, my memory of the Apollo program and the moon mission in the 60s. That's the closest I can come to. But there's something else at work here. And it's an authentic mystery. And I'm of the mind that if we understood what that trigger was, we could reactivate the process in our own time. But I don't think we're going to be building cathedrals. What would this kind of work? What kind of form would it take? What kind of incarnation would it take in our own time? This is the thing I want you to be thinking about. And how can this knowledge that is at our disposal now be unified and brought to bear to understand? And this is where we get into the whole idea of education and why we need to completely revolution and revamp our educational system. And we have modern technologies, but we also have access to ancient traditions, hallowed traditions, proven traditions. And what we've got now is basically a factory system that dumbs people down, makes them incapable of thinking critically, thinking independently, basically just doing what they're told. Don't ask questions. Trust the experts. How many of you watched Graham Hancock's Ancient Apocalypse series? Good. Okay. Now, maybe there's 50 or 60, 70 of you that were watching this, watched it. And how many of you watching that would come away independently with the conclusion that, oh, Graham Hancock is a racist and a white supremacist? Did anybody in here get that from that Ancient Apocalypse show? Yet every critic I read, every attack on him, and there had to have been at least 8 or 10 of them that I read, they all were saying the same exact thing, even to the point of using some of the same terminology. So what's going on there? And why are the experts so afraid of us reconsidering our own history?
Because a paradigm shift means they're out of business.
Stephen just said, because a paradigm shift means they're out of business, and that's a big part of it right there. But they are really, see, there was a time a decade or two ago when, people like myself and Graham and Ed and Robert Schock and others who were doing this kind of stuff thought, well, we're safely out on the fringe. Nobody's going to put a target on us because we're talking about ancient engineers or any of that kind of stuff. But here we are now in 2022, 2023, and people proposing alternate interpretations of our own history are being targeted. Now, not literally, I don't think anybody's going to attempt to assassinate Graham, but what they're trying to do is assassinate his character. Why? Well, as I've read through some of the things, and I've actually composed and written a whole response to the critics, which is going to be online soon. A couple of things jumped to the forefront. One was this. Graham Hancock is promoting dangerous conspiracy theories. That was said over and over again, right? And Flint Dibble, one of the experts who said, I'm a real archaeologist. Who are you going to believe, Graham Hancock or me, right? He was one. There were several others. They said very similar things like this. In conclusion, well, why should we be concerned? One journalist is talking to, I think it was one of the archaeologists who led this attack. Well, why should we be concerned about, this? Isn't it just some harmless fringe? Well, no, because if you believe Graham Hancock over the experts, well, you might believe that doctors would lie. You might believe that politicians would lie. You might, they even said this, you might believe that 9/11 was a conspiracy. One of them even said that. Now, what it told me as I'm reading that, and I'm getting into dangerous territory here, is that the whole construction of reality that we've been spoon-fed for a couple of generations now is a house of cards. And the fact that they would be scared of somebody like Graham Hancock, who's the kind, gentle British gentleman, asking questions and proposing alternate interpretation of history, the fact that they should find it so important to galvanize and put out these talking points, and that's another question. Obviously, if they're all, like nobody in here read or watched that series and concluded that Graham Hancock's a white supremacist. But are you telling me all of these archaeologists and journalists and stuff independently concluded that? No way. They're all reading from the same talking points or from the same script. So then the question becomes, who's writing this script? And I don't know the answer, but somebody is. And it's somebody who doesn't want the truth out, doesn't want people asking questions. And I've used this story many times in these kinds of discussions, when getting back to the Grail stories. In one of the stories, I think it's Chrétien's story, was Percival is on the quest. And he's been, struggling for years through the wasteland looking for the Grail. And he comes upon a lake or a river, and it's the Fisher King is out there. And Ed made an interesting point when he showed, the phonetic correlation between an angler and angle, the word angle. Did he bring that up today? Interesting correlation. Did you, Ed?
Not today, last night.
Last night, yeah. But that's something you frequently bring that up, right? So the angler, the Fisher King, who Percival didn't recognize who he was. It turns out he's the son of the elderly king that is in the nearby castle, debilitated. The Fisher King tells him how to get to the castle Corbenic. He finds his way to the key. He never found it if he hadn't encountered this mysterious fisherman. He goes to the castle Corbenic, and he goes in, and there's this great hall, huge hall, sumptuously decorated, and lots of people there feasting and merriment, and he's seated on a dais there, and then he is presented with this whole pageant where all of these young people come parading through the great hall, carrying artifacts and things, symbols, and one of them, beautiful young maiden, comes through carrying the Grail itself, and it's so resplendent that when she comes into the hall with it, people have to avert their eyes because the light emanating from the Grail is so intense. Now, in his training, Percival had apprenticed to an old knight who had said, don't speak superficially. Don't jabber on and chatter superficially. Keep your repose, keep quiet, do more listening than you do talking, right? It's not seemingly for a knight to just, to speak without, just to speak indiscriminately. So he was keeping this in mind as he's sitting there watching this pageant. What he didn't realize was the whole pageant there was designed for him. And the purpose of it was that he was they were presenting each of the symbols, the candelabra, a bleeding lance, all of these things that were paraded in front of him had a meaning to him, a deep symbolical meaning. And he was supposed to ask the question, what does it mean? What does this whole thing mean that I'm seeing here? And instead, he kept thinking the admonition of the old knight that he had apprenticed under. And so he kept his tongue. He didn't ask the question. He didn't speak. He just observed. So night comes, he goes to a room, goes to sleep, and he wakes up in the morning, and he's the only one in the castle, and it appears as if it's been abandoned for centuries. There's nobody there. It's empty, spider webs and dirt, and he's the only one there. Everything has disappeared. And he wanders back out into the wasteland. And all of a sudden he's accosted by this shrieking old hag who runs up to him and starts screaming at him. You didn't say anything. You didn't ask the question. All of this was done for your benefit, and you were supposed to ask what it meant. And if you had asked what it meant, you would have learned the meaning, and the curse would have been lifted. The landscape would have been healed. The ailing king would have been restored. But you didn't ask the question that needed to be asked, that was begging to be asked. And now you're going to have to wander for years to come to finally conclude this quest. The quest. What is the ultimate idea behind the quest? The question, to ask the question. And now, we are being discouraged from asking questions. We are not supposed to ask questions. Graham was attacked by mainstream media because he dared to ask questions. Well, we're going to ask questions because we have a lot of questions, because there are some factions that have a lot of explaining to do. Let's go on here. Many of the sculptors and architects of the ancient world were initiates of the mysteries, particularly the Eleusinian rites. Since the dawn of time, the truers of stone and the hewers of wood have constituted a divinely inspired caste. The profound knowledge of mathematics and astronomy embodied in ancient architecture, and the equally profound knowledge of anatomy revealed in Greek statuary, prove that the fashioners of both were masterminds, deeply cultured in the wisdom which constituted the arcana of the mysteries. Thus was established the Guild of the Builders, progenitors of modern Freemasons. When employed to build palaces, temples, or tombs, or to carve statues for the wealthy, those initiated architects and artists concealed in their works the secret doctrine. So that now, long after their bones have returned to dust, the world realizes that those first artisans were indeed truly initiated and worthy to receive the wages of Master Mason. The most celebrated of the ancient fraternities of artisans was that of the Dionysiac architects. This organization was composed exclusively of initiates of the Bacchus Dionysius cult and was peculiarly consecrated to the science of building and the art of decoration. Acclaimed as being the custodians of a secret and sacred knowledge of architectonics, its members were entrusted with the design and erection of public buildings and monuments. The superlative excellence of their handiwork elevated the members of the guild to a position of surpassing dignity. They were regarded as the master craftsmen of the earth. They made their appearance certainly not later than 1000 BC, which interestingly Freemasons will trace their origins to the building of King Solomon's temple, which occurred right around 1000 BC. And they appear to have enjoyed particular privileges and immunities. They also possessed secret means of recognition and were bound together by special ties only known to themselves. They were divided into communities governed by a master and wardens. They held a grand festival annually and were held in high esteem. Their ceremonials were regarded as sacred. They had means of intercommunication all over the then known world. And from them, doubtless, sprang the guilds of traveling masons known in the Middle Ages. I'm going to go on here. Freemasonry, most of all, owes to the Dionysiac cult the great mass of its symbols and rituals, which are related to the science of architecture. From these ancient and illustrious artisans, it has also received the legacy of the unfinished temple of civilization. That vast, invisible structure upon which these initiated builders have labored continuously since the inception of the fraternity. This mighty edifice, which has fallen and been rebuilt time after time, but whose foundations remain unmoved, is the true everlasting house of which the temple on the brow of Mount Moriah was but an impermanent symbol. And that would be the reference to King Solomon's temple. This image is particularly compelling. This is an image that's prevalent in the Masonic order. I'm sure Warren and Ryan have seen this. We have Father Time representing oftentimes Saturn. Remember Saturn, Kronos, right? He has there a great scythe or sickle. And you have this maiden who is weeping over a broken column. She holds in her left hand the ciborium, the Grail. sealed with the blood, the royal blood, the holy blood. In her right hand, she holds the acacia, a symbol of rejuvenation and everlasting life. But we also know it's the source of something else. How many of you know? Stephen, what is it?
DMT.
It's the source of DMT. And then we have the hourglass. Notice he's also plaiting or braiding her hair. Long hair. That's a clue. There are several things here that are clues. One is this. We were talking in the first part of this talk about comets, weren't we? Cometa, from the Latin and the Greek, means long-haired. Long-haired. So, because early people seeing comets envisioned a person, usually a maiden, with long hair flowing out, which was the tail of the comet. The broken column, that represents civilization. Aside from the operative aspect of their order, the Dionysiac architects had a speculative philosophic code. Human society they considered as a rough and untrued ashlar. That is the stone when it's first removed from bedrock, only lately chiseled from the quarry of elemental nature. This crude block was the true object upon which these skilled craftsmen labored, polishing it, squaring it, and with the aid of fine carvings, transforming it into a miracle of beauty, because there was a whole process that had to transpire between extracting stone, that rough ashlar, before it could be fitted as part of the cathedral or the temple, as the case may be. Okay, so I want to show you something here. We have two columns here, part of the 5 architectural orders. Warren, what is the architectural order of these columns? Corinthian, yes. Corinthian is characterized by the foliage emerging from the top of the column. And this indicates a very profound philosophical idea that was held in mind by these builders of old. That is, the stones were erected in such a way that they were like living stones, conduits of literal energy. And that energy, once it was assembled in the right place, with the right orientation, with the right materials, that energy could ascend the column, and that was actually living energy. And so the metaphorical explosion of foliage at the top of the column represents this idea that the life force is traveling up the columns, infusing the temple itself. That's what this is telling you right here. While mystics released their souls from the bondage of matter by meditation, and philosophers found their keenest joy in the profundities of thought, these master workmen achieved liberation from the wheel of life and death by learning to swing their hammers with the same rhythm that moves the swirling forces of the cosmos. Now, that's a whole different way of approaching the art of building than prevails today, when it's like, we got a budget, we got to come in under budget, we got to earn a profit. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that. And in fact, I think you can still keep all that in mind, but you have to add this higher dimension to it. And then it transmorphs into something else. They venerated the deity under the guise of the great architect and master craftsman who was ever gouging rough ashlars from the fields of space and truing them into universes. The Dionysians affirmed constructiveness to be the supreme expression of the soul, and attuning themselves with the ever-visible, constructive natural processes going on around them, believed immortality could be achieved by thus becoming a part of the creative agencies of nature. So the question then is that what would be the form of work that we would undertake in this age in which we find ourselves? We're going to have to skip a few things because there's a whole lot. Like Ed, the frustrating part is we never have enough time. But I'm using my website, my podcast to dive deep into all of these things, to explore some of the tangents and the byways and the, going off the main trunk. One of the things, the analogies that I use, and it's kind of my own, probably others have used it, but because I'm so geologically oriented, I kind of think of this stream of knowledge, a stream of wisdom, as a great underground river. And from time to time, this river emerges from the surface and flows underground, above ground. And when that happens, civilization prospers, it flowers, all kinds of good things happen. If we go back to the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, during the building of the Gothic period, interestingly, we see population increase, we see lifespans increase, we see diminishing of debilitating diseases, we see a diminishing of infant mortality. We actually see the stature of Europeans increasing during that period of time by 3 to 4 inches on average, right? That period came to an end. It was followed by the onset of the so-called Little Ice Age. And the world went from warmth to cold. Crops died in the fields and people went hungry. And it's the same repeat of what happened in the 500s, in the year 500s, when the year 536 AD, paleoclimatologists have looked at that and said, that year, 536 AD, appears to have been the coldest year of the last 2,000 years. And it was followed by a decade of cold that gripped the planet. And in fact, dendrochronologists who study tree rings were able to discern that for 10 years, almost all forest growth stopped. Because it went from fat rings to very almost indiscernible skinny rings because they weren't getting enough warmth and moisture, and they just stopped growing. That decade was enough to launch the world into 300 years of the Dark Ages. That one decade. What brought that on? It's questionable. I think there were several agencies probably involved. There's 2 great impact craters, one off the coast of Norway, one off the coast of New Zealand, appear to date right from that period. There was also a spasm of global volcanism that may have actually been related to those impact events. So, what does that lead us to? Well, it leads us to this. If we go back and we talk about the Holy Grail and the quest basically ended with the great Battle of Camelon, where Arthur was killed. The date of that battle is usually given by historians as between 540 and 542 AD. Interestingly, after 6 or 7 years of the cold and the crops dying in the fields and people going hungry, you had, in 542 AD, the Justinian plague that wiped out almost half the population of Europe. And it took 300 years to recover from that. And then you had a similar thing that happened in the early 1300s. And we see that the return of the cold into the world coincides precisely with the end of the great Gothic building enterprise. And in, like I said, 1340, right in around there, you had the bubonic plague that again wiped out 1/3 to half the population of Europe. And here we have Beauvais and Bourges. You can see how amazing these are as we go through some of this. Chartres Cathedral. You can't even begin to fathom the amount of meaning and symbolism that's been encoded into this one structure. From the great rose window up above the door, 12 petals representing the 12 signs of the zodiac and the cosmic journey. The 2 towers, one dedicated to the solar energy, one dedicated to the lunar energy. The ground plan itself, which is based upon the proportions of the root 3 that I was talking about earlier, which comes from the geometric symbol of the Vesica Piscis, which is the supreme symbol of the feminine. And it's from the Vesica that the entire edifice of Euclidean geometry emerges. It begins with the drawing of 2 circles, as I've shown repeatedly in my classes. And that length to width ratio is the root 3. And there's the Vesica that defines that length to width ratio. St. Mary's Chapel that I mentioned before, that's on the west end of Glastonbury. I said its width was 39.6 and its length was 68.6. If you do the math, you'll discover it's the square root of 3 relationship. So it too is based upon that, and it's appropriate, dedicated to Mary, that it would embody the feminine geometry. I'm going to go through some of this. Okay, so here's the ground plan. There you see the 39.6. Now, 39.6, we determined earlier that our Glenn, right? You still got, okay, 7920 diameter of the Earth. Diameter. Radius is half that number, right? So divide 7920 by 2. And how many miles in the radius of the Earth?
3960.
3960. 3,960. Coincidence that 39.6 feet is the width of Mary's Chapel? Stonehenge, right? There's the Sarsen stone circle. There's the great lintels. And here is the ground plan. And check this out. Sarsen stone circle, 100.8 feet. Outer face, 105.6. Divide that by 2 and there's your 52.8, which is 1/100th of a mile. Average length of the Sarsen stone lintels, 10.56 feet. The number of Sarsen stone lintels, 30. So the bluestone circle, which is this, the smaller circle right here. Here's its 79.2 feet. And the bluestone horseshoe, which is this, is laid out on a circle of 39.6. So in other words, this circle here, upon which this was laid out, is precisely the same size as the original chapel at Glastonbury, 39.6 feet. And that preserves an Earth number, the radius of the Earth. So, but there's more than that going on here that we don't have time to get into today. But it's all part of this sacred geometry. You can see here's some of the geometry utilized. And now notice the bluestone circle, which I've kind of done with actually a blue circle here. The Sarsen stone circle, if you draw this on the center of the stones, now the thickness of the stones is very carefully worked out. You've got the center of the stones and you've got the facing of the stones, so you can get 2 different ways of measuring, just like you've got 2 different ways of measuring the Great Pyramid. One, the pyramid on the circle, and then on the other one, the pyramid with the cornerstones in place, which they're not there anymore, but you can still see the indentations in the bedrock that held those stones. So you can actually measure the perimeter of the base 2 different ways. Anyways, but if you take this difference between these 2 circles right here, and you use that as a radius and draw a circle, as I've done here, it has the same proportions as the Earth to the Moon, precisely. And if we take St. Mary's Chapel, exactly dimensioned, juxtapose it on this diagram of Stonehenge, it fits exactly in here. And furthermore, if you take the axis of St. Mary's Chapel, which is angled just a little bit north of the parallel, and you draw that line, it targets Stonehenge, an example of sacred geography. So there's a lot going on here. Parthenon, it fits into a perfect golden rectangle. And this is showing some of the internal geometry And we could go into a lot of this, which I'm saving for my classes and my online stuff, and we don't have time today. So I'm going to jump over real quick and talk about the idea. I'll just show this one thing here. This is the Shiloh Mound Complex, which is actually in Tennessee. And this is the ground plan of it. And I've studied quite in depth. At some point, Bradley and I think are going to organize a tour of the extant earthworks that are still here in North America. But this Shiloh complex, this is showing the layout of the complex, and then juxtaposed over that is the Pleiades. And the Pleiades were very important to ancient peoples, and many of the calendars were organized around the Pleiades. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to quickly open another folder, another show. One of the things that I think where this work in our own time begins is education. I mean, it has to start there. We have to start putting this kind of knowledge at the disposal of young people. To know that that there is this realm of knowing and wisdom that actually exists, because they're not being told that in these indoctrination factories that are called public education. And that's what they are. They're indoctrination factories. And so I've kind of come up with, tried to go, how do you get from a vision to an actual implementation? And of course, as a builder, and as you would know as an architect, it starts up here, right? You have to have a vision and inspiration. Then you have to get it from there to an actual structure that's built, where you bring together the materials and the skills and the people and everything to make it real in the three-dimensional realm. Well, this is the same thing. Our challenge now is to figure out how to get this kind of knowledge and this wisdom out there into the world, because I think as the more it does, the more it's going to stimulate people towards knowledge. And the more you prevent this kind of information, that there is this, what can I say? Maybe put it this way, to reveal to people that there's intelligence imbued in creation, that there's actually intelligence. And so I'm calling this the Sanctuary Project for now, a prototype of the possible. Sanctuary is defined as a consecrated place or a place of refuge and protection. To consecrate means dedicated to a sacred purpose, or to make inviolable or venerable. And there are stories about the inviolability of sacred spaces during times of destruction and cataclysm and so on. Very interesting stories historically. So what I'm going to do is just show a couple of things here, because I know we're running out of time. This is showing the idea of a sacred landscape and using extended extrasensory perceptions to be able to map the energies in a sacred landscape. Here's different ways that, like I said earlier, I've tried it myself with some results. I've seen it being done. And there are various ways of doing it. Yeah, here's a couple of Marines that are using it to detect mines. And this is some of the work that gets into this. Nigel Pennick, Paul Devereaux, and I'm going to have a reading list online. I don't know if it's there yet, but it's going to be recommending books and things that people can read. Victor Schauberger's work, very important, and leads directly into the work that Bradley and I have been doing with Malcolm, the mad scientist, who's taken the work of Tesla and Victor Schauberger and many others, predecessors, and has carried it to the next level. The Pattern of the Past, Guy Underwood, very interesting work. He was a geomancer who mapped a lot of the sacred structures in Europe and was able to show that underlying these structures, from going back to Gothic times all the way back thousands of years ago, were connected by this pattern of geomantic energy in the landscape. And so these are just some of the ideas of how, see, I believe that, you know, I'm kind of out of that era of the late 60s, early 70s, where a lot of people had this idea that, you know, the dominant culture was going corrupt, that the road to salvation was to get out of the dominant culture. The byword, the slogan was from Timothy Leary was tune in, drop out. Wait, tune in, turn on, and drop out. Thank you. I looked at you because I knew you would. Yeah. Yeah, I did too, actually. Yeah, this was a long time ago. But so that was kind of where it was motivating people. And the problem was there was a lot of inexperience, a lot of naivety, and so on. And most of the efforts to create an alternative society failed. But that was 50 years ago. There's a lot of things we've learned since then. A lot of things that I think, you know, another go at it is not only potentially successful, but actually has to happen at this point. And this just, in my mind, one of the mistakes was, okay, we have to drop out and basically have nothing to do with the dominant culture. My mind is, well, we interact with, I've built a business within the framework of the dominant culture. We need to basically have two strategies. One, you work within the existing system, but in the event that the existing system collapses, just like with the mass extinction of the dinosaurs, once those big lumbering dinosaurs were out of the way, the mammals could move into those vacated niches and prosper. It might be something similar to that, because what is going on now is not sustainable. It can't be. There's too many ways that it's some major course correction. It's not going to be sustainable. And so, you know, again, for me, it begins with education. We try to, you know, I did for 15 years, I organized classes for homeschool kids. And I just got into it because a friend of mine, there was a homeschool movement in Atlanta in the 90s. And this friend of mine, Brad Riley, was involved with that. And what it was a group of parents whose children were going through the Waldorf education system. The Waldorf in Atlanta at that time had no high school. They only went up to 8th grade. And one of the things about the Waldorf that I found very intriguing, and never even had occurred to me, that there was a system of education where the teacher would start working with a group of students that were like kindergarten age and go all the way up through middle school with the same teacher. And I thought, well, good grief, how different that is, you know, because now think about how a teacher is going to really get to intimately know the children as compared to, you know, you got 30 kids in a class and then the next year it's somebody else, and then you get to middle school and you've got 5 teachers. Even by the end of the year, they're not going to necessarily, teachers and you know, who's that kid sitting in the back of the class, right? And this was oh, wow, I never thought of that. Wow, what a great way to do it, you know. But the thing is that they had no schooling after 8th grade. It ended there. So a group of the parents got together, organized a homeschooling program, and all of these kids that had graduated, was the first graduating class of the Waldorf school in Atlanta, joined this kind of, it was homeschooling. Some of them probably went on to public school, but a lot of them decided to get homeschooled with the parents. And so they rented a couple of rooms in a church. They hired this guy, Brad Riley, to be a main lesson instructor. And what he then did was recruited people to come in to do special programs. So it was in March of 1995 or 96, I forgot, and I run into him somewhere and he says, "Hey, you're still doing the geometry stuff, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah." So would you come in and do like a couple of weeks of introducing these kids to sacred geometry? Yeah, I was kind of between jobs. I said, yeah, I'll do that. And I had already been organizing courses for adults and using the classical methods of straight edge and compass to do the drawings and to walk people into the experience of sacred geometry. Thought, well, I've never done this with kids, but let me give it a go. So I went in and I did 2 weeks. And I think we met 2 or 3 days a week for 2 weeks. And this was in March. And then at the end of that, I said, okay, well, there we go. I hope the kids liked it. A couple of days go by, Brad calls me back and says, well, the kids are wondering if you would come back and do more. I said, okay, yeah, sure, why not? I can take time off from work to come for a couple hours, a couple of days a week. I did that. Finished up. Guess what happened a couple of days later? Brad Riley calls me and says, you know, they really want you to come back. Because what I did was I turned it into math and art. I had them drawing and coloring, and this is how I was teaching geometry, right? Well, I ended up finishing the end of the year with those kids. Then summer vacation came. Over the summer, I started getting phone calls from parents of, kids who were not in the class. And one thing led to another, and I did this for the next 15 years and probably had somewhere around 120, 130 kids go through these programs. I refined the programs. I began to add science. I had one group of 3 boys, and we did a science fair project. We entered a national contest with, I think, 14 or 15,000 other entrants, and we got second place nationally. So it was a very gratifying experience, but it was during that experience that I began to really think deeply about education. And when I saw firsthand the difference, and sometimes I would get kids who had been in public school and it had just turned into a fiasco. I would get a call from a mother and she would say, my boy he's just not prospering in school. Can I try him in your class? Sure. So I got a number of the kids that came right out of public school and got to the point where I was actually able to almost immediately identify somebody who had not been subject to that whole public school experience, just like that, upon just talking to them for a few minutes. The other thing I really noticed was the relationship between the kids being homeschooled and their parents. It was a totally different dynamic. And I think about, back in my generation, it was the first generation where we had heard the phrase, the generation gap. Well, that was because post-World War II, when us baby boomers were coming into the world, this was where the education system in the country went from small, independent schools, the schoolhouse, into these huge factories. They started in the 40s, it accelerated in the 50s. The federal government came in and, we started building the federal highway system. And the hammer that they used was consolidate your school districts or you don't get your highway funds. So it forced the states to begin consolidating. So you had lots and lots of small, independent, autonomous school districts being consolidated into these big, 1,500, 2,000 student schools. And the reason for that was, obviously, they began to come in and begin to control the curriculum and set the standards. And that was the beginning, I think, of the downfall of education in this country. Because they're coming up with a standardized system, and it's designed not to inculcate critical thinking, independent thinking, but just the opposite of that. And I rebelled big time in my primarily high school years, and I have lots of kind of entertaining stories about that I'm not going to get into, but I rebelled. I didn't finish high school. I was a little short, and then 4 years later, I did 2 years of night school and 2 months of high school and made up my entire last year of school. So one of the things that I did in working with these classes with the kids is that, I've got building projects going on simultaneously. And on these building projects, I've even seen math and geometry and trigonometry and so on. So we would have lessons in geometry or trigonometry or whatever it might be, and I would bring the kids to the job sites so they could see, look, here's how we're using, on all these carpenters are using rise over run to build this roof, to build these stairs, whatever, right? Well, rise over run, that's simply the tangent function we just learned about in the classroom. So what I would do is get the kids engaged and, okay, now here's the problem. Here's our total rise, here's our total run. Let's go back to the classroom, we'll sketch it out, and I want you guys to help me design the roof here. Other things that I would do, we had a stream nearby, and we would go out there and set up very simple makeshift stream gauges where, again, on my old trusty 150-foot fiberglass tape, we could stretch it along the stream. We would take topographic maps. I would bring topographic maps in. I would teach about the different quadrangles and what it meant, a 7.5 minutes, 100 minutes, 200, and using that to teach scaling, and teaching them about how to read maps. We would use those maps to draw a stream profile. We'd go out to the stream, and then I'd have the kids looking for high water marks. Like, we go there through normal, let's say normal discharge. You can see the stream, here it's normal. Well, then might have a huge rainfall. So we'd go there within a couple of days after that, and I would have the kids, okay, what we would do is we would get a flotation device, drop it in the water, and stopwatch and time how fast the water was moving, and we would come back and calculate Q. The letter Q stood for peak discharge. Calculate the Q, then the rain would come, we'd go back out there, and we could look for clues, like, look, there's a clump of leaves that's been packed into the branches of a tree. Well, that means the water was up at that level. Or, look, here's a little piece of trash hanging from a branch. Water level was up there. Or, look, here's a fresh layer of sand up on the floodplain. So then we could go back and we could calculate what was the difference between the normal flow and the flow. And so we're actually using the math. I can show you, like, let's see here. If I speed through this thing. We're down to 5 minutes. Okay, well, then we'll skip that. But yeah, so that's what I would do. I would get the kids as much as possible out of the classroom into the real world, show them how we would use geometry, trigonometry, mathematics, and I think it made a huge difference in their learning, in their appreciation, because now they were seeing how it could be applied. So what I've come up with now is a scheme, a plan, a vision for a kind of a school where people of all ages can come. It's not segregated by age. And one of the things that I've really noticed now since we've been doing these educational, geological, archaeological tours that Brad and I have been organizing and doing now, we've got one coming up at the end of the month. We're going to be going up into some of the hidden landscapes of eastern Kentucky. But I guess about a couple of years ago, we had a lady call us and wanting to know, well, I'd like to come, but, I have nobody to watch my daughter. What do you think? Can kids come? Yeah, of course, bring her. And so we've had more and more kids coming. And what I've realized is, here's something very interesting. You get a group of adults who are all ages. We would have anywhere from how old are you? 19? And so how old were you on your first trip? 18? And you remember little Sophia and Shinga, and they were 9 years old. And well, so here was the thing I noticed. Within a couple of days, it's like this thing, the stigma between adults and kids was sort of, we're all in it together and having a really good time, right? Little Sophia, she was like the first day very quiet, reserved, very shy, didn't say hardly a word. By day 3, she's jabbering, talking about how cool everything is, playing tricks on people, all kinds of cool stuff like that. And I've noticed this every time. Now in my generation, I was mentioning the generation gap. Well, because I grew up in a place where, my dad would go to work, I would come home, he'd be tired, I'd have my homework to do or whatever. And he wasn't really would rarely even ask me, well, what are you doing for your homework? He was not engaged. And it's just the way the system was set up at that point. I'm there, where am I getting my values from? Not so much my father, although I did, because it was his example of hard work and my grandfather's hard work that ultimately inspired me to, move beyond just being a hippie. And although I was never a lazy hippie, I was always an energetic, got to get some things done here. But that generation gap thing was very much a product of the fact that we're warehoused and kids are now not so much taking their cues for behavior and morality and understanding and things from their elders, but from their peers. That doesn't work. You have to have, and some of the kids that were in my homeschool class were involved in scouting. And so I got sort of peripherally involved, going to some of the things, the events when, a student that I'd been tutoring for 2 or 3 years was in scouting and becomes an Eagle Scout. And I noticed something there because when I was a kid, I'd been a Cub Scout. And we moved or something, so I never made it beyond that. But what I remember, my older brother was also a Boy Scout. And so what you had there was, they were not, to some extent, because Cub Scouts, I think, we were 9 through 12, and then when you hit adolescence, you became a Boy Scout, something like that. But what I noticed was you had the younger kids were now taking their cues of behavior and things from older kids who were then taking their cues from young adults who were taking their cues from older, mature people. And so it kind of was like this trickle down almost, and it really changed the whole dynamic. So I became really convinced that this artificial segregation of kids by age is damaging. Yeah, I think it is very much. And so in my vision that I want to, we'll be sharing all of this online and stuff and doing more events like this, is that, the philosophy should be, which is my philosophy, is that I'm going to be a student till the day I die. I'm, just because you finish high school or graduate from college, you don't just stop learning then. You keep on learning and you be excited about learning. And the other thing was that as I did organize these classes for the homeschool kids, whenever somebody would come in and, say, I've got, my son or my daughter, and generally the range would range from 9 to 17. The youngest I ever had was 9, the oldest was 17. But what I said was, as long as we had room, and I had this nice big room in a church, what we'll do is, if there's room and you're paying my very, very affordable fee for your kids, is you can attend for free. So I always had 2 or 3 adults in the class working right alongside the kids. And one of the interesting things that I noticed was soon the kids were teaching the adults. One of the adults sitting there wasn't getting it, so the 10-year-old would come over and, let me show you how to do that. And pretty soon they're showing them how you draw a right angle or whatever it might be. And I thought, yeah, now this is the way it should be. This is how it should be, And so what I'm envisioning now, and I've done a lot of work towards this, and I've been a builder. The 2 things I've done for earn my keep in the world is I've been a builder and a teacher. And I thought, how do those 2 things come together? We'll build a school. And, I had parents over the years tell me, yeah, you should build a school and do this on a larger, well, I don't want to do it too much on a larger scale because it's the intimacy of it, I think, that is really so powerful. But with the right combination of people, it could certainly work on a larger scale. Because then the little group that I had that usually ranged from 5 to 8 students, and 8 was usually my cutoff because I knew that up to 8 students, I pretty much could get to know them. And if somebody was falling behind, I would know. And here was the other thing that occurred, is that I saw that students began helping each other. If somebody wasn't getting it, just like going over to the grown-ups, so I would get like maybe the 12-year-old would be helping the 10-year-old. And that actually created a whole sense of self-worth. That 12 or 13-year-old teaching the 10-year-old was very powerful. So anyways, what I would like to encourage all of you to do, and because we're, I guess, about out of time, is that, randallcarlson.com, tried to make it easy. We do our podcast, and I'm going to be posting over the next few months. I'm going to be posting all kinds of ideas. I've got way more stuff here that I could show you about how we could actually adapt those ancient principles to the 21st century. And in my vision of it, the building and the creation, the design and creation and implementation of a school like this, that would be the ultimate teaching exercise. And that it would be the students themselves. We would go in there and learn together, learn how, like these guys are setting a pole in the earth, and how it starts with something that simple. By putting a pole in the earth and marking the motions of the heavens based upon a pole set into the earth. But the setting of the pole is not just arbitrary. It has to be determined energetically by that geomantic survey. So that's where it begins, by doing a geomantic survey. And then building in harmony with the energies that are prevalent at the site, orienting using all of the sacred principles that have come down to us traditionally, but adapted to our own time. And I think it would be a tremendously interesting project to undertake. And then it could be a source, a place, because as valuable as, being able to communicate with people all over the world now, which I've been doing via Zoom meetings and all the rest, and emails from people all over the world, that is not a substitute for what we're doing right here, where we are meeting each other in person. And we need to kind of make sure that we keep that alive and active, the personal connections, and not let it just turn into, well, I don't need to go there because I'll just see you on Zoom. I don't need to see you firsthand. Because I can imagine how deprived I would feel, for example, if I couldn't see Stephen right in front of me at this moment. So his smiling face. So let's all basically keep in touch. And the other thing, and the final thing I'll say is that if this whole other thing that's been kind of brewing in the background comes to fore, what that might mean is we may have at our disposal a system of energy based on plasma physics that could be used to power a whole community, independent. Now, I'm not going to go so far as to commit and say it's absolutely certain, but the more that I learn, the more I see the potential there for bringing this whole other dimension of things, and also the conviction that our ancestors knew about these alternative technologies and employed them, and that what we're seeing in the remnants of Stonehenge and the pyramids and the temples and the earthworks and everything was part of a vast sacred machine, a type of technology. And they weren't just built for, religious. You ask our architect, why were they built? Well, for a ceremonial purpose. Well, what was the ceremony? What ceremony, right? Well, I think that it was all part of a vast technological system where you utilize the energies of the harmony of the earth and the heavens themselves, and we've lost it. And the Grail is about recovering that lost technology that can heal the wasteland. And so I think that's where the immediate incarnation of the great work during our time is we start by putting down a cornerstone. I'd like to think that maybe Tennessee might be a good place to establish that first cornerstone. So we got a lot of work to do, but it's going to be really fun. All right, so I think that's it.